All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the overview of the new proposed payment model training. Your presenters will be Liz Barlow, Senior Director of Quality, and Mary Vandekamp, Senior Vice President of Quality. Looks like we do have a full house today, so we'd ask everyone stays on mute throughout the duration of the presentation. At this time, I'd like to welcome Liz Barlow. Liz, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ted. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this seminar or webinar. We all know there's been a lot of discussion around the patient-driven payment model, also known as PDPM. So we hope that you will leave this webinar certainly with a better understanding of the outline and the basics of it. And I want to start first. This is one of my favorite slides for anybody who's been around Medicare for very long, because I really feel like it represents how we all feel right now, is that we're in a Medicare maze. And certainly the complexities are just continuous with Medicare, with everything that they seem to be putting out, whether it's RCS1 or PDPM or value-based purchasing. We are just bombarded with information, and it's hard to keep up with. So our objectives for today will be essentially to certainly review PDPM basics, and also we're going to talk a little bit about the comparison of PDPM with RUGS-4 and also RCS1. We want to be able to determine the basic formula for the PDPM payment rate and understand the functional components for PT and OT and also for nursing, and review and discuss how the facility is able to prepare for reform. And Ted, are you hearing me okay? I just got a text that they were having volume difficulties.
Yes, Liz, I hear you perfectly. You sound really good.
Okay, thank you.
There must be an issue with them.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Thanks so much. Okay, before we go into a little bit more on PDPM, let's talk about the history and where this came from. We know that the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission for years and years have been making, again, recommendations on changes to the current PPS model. You know, in addition to that, we've all, felt and seen the scrutiny of payments to SNFs and the scrutiny of high therapy RUG scores, right? So part of their recommendation has been certainly to focus a little bit more on the changes to payment so that it's more based on patient characteristics. And on May 4th of 2017, we certainly are familiar with the RCS1 that came out. And in my years of being around Medicare and Medicare regulations, this was, it was called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And it's the first time that I can remember that they've ever done that. And essentially it was a, hey, we're going to touch base and see how you all feel about this. And there were a lot of comments, including comments from Kindred, that, and they listened, which is a good sign. They actually listened to the comments that we generated. And so about February of this year, there was an open door forum that John Kane, who is a CMS member, said, people keep asking me when RCS1's coming out, and he goes, and we don't have an answer for that, essentially, is what he said. So we all breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that no payment reform was coming anytime soon. And then on April 27th, they surprised us with really a revamped version of RCS1 and called it this PDPM. The one thing that I do want to talk about as we go through these slides and we go through further discussion is that it's still a proposed rule at this point. The final rule from this will probably come out around August, but again, Kindred, along with others, are reviewing this information and will be submitting comments to CMS, which are due at the end of this month. So again, just remember, this is a proposed rule right now, and we do think conceptually that this is what it's going to look like, but there certainly may be some more changes. So a couple of highlights, just some broad highlights for PDPM is that, we know CMS has been focusing in on from a volume to a value-based program. And we see that with the QRP program, the quality measures that come from that, the 5-star, the bundled payment initiatives, value-based purchasing. Everything that they are doing right now is focused much more on outcomes and certainly transparency of those outcomes, that, you know, they're putting more and more of that information on their website for everyone to see. It is based on patient characteristics, which we will go through, versus, you know, services rendered. They are saying that this is budget neutral. Proposed implementation date will be a little over a year from now, so fiscal year 2020, which begins October 1st, 2019. And they are also saying that there will be a decrease in provider burden, that this model will save providers $200 million a year or $2 billion over the next 10 years. And that primarily is based on what they are saying is due to paperwork and MDS work. And again, we'll go into a little bit more detail on that. Wanted just to share before we move into what PDPM looks like. This is the current PPS model, and we are all familiar with this certainly, in that it is divided out into a therapy component, a nursing component, and a non-case mix component. And it's in a hierarchy, right, primarily based on services provided. And this is what it looks like now under PDPM. So the therapy component is essentially broken out into PT, OT, speech. We've got nursing component that is now a separate nursing payment. There's also a non-therapy ancillary payment. And those 5 components all have case mix indices that go with those. We will talk more about that. And then there is a non-case mix payment that stays steady. There's no change to that. And that essentially, as CMS says, covers room and board and administrative costs and those types of things. So here's what it looks like now. And again, we're going to go through each of these, but you can see that for the 5 components that have case mix indices associated with it, there is also a base rate. So you can see PT, OT, speech, nursing, and non-therapy ancillary all have a base rate associated with it. In addition, there is a CMI associated with those. And then in 3 different categories, the PT, the OT, and the non-therapy ancillary, there is also an adjustment factor. And again, here we are. We've got the non-case mix base rate, which doesn't change. Before I go into some of these components, I did just want to take a minute to stress that just because the payment structure for us in SNF is changing, that the skilled service criteria does not change. They have not put out or documented anything that has given us any indication that the benefit policy manual verbiage is changing or anything associated with that. So the 3-day stay still stays the same. Our skilled services and medical necessity guidelines are still staying the same right now. So just keep that in mind as we walk through this. Some of the changes, for those of you who may have followed and really studied RCS-1, is that they have separated, as I said a minute ago, PT and OT and RCS-1 were actually pulled together and had a cognitive component. In PDPM, they're actually separate. Functional areas now, we are very used to utilizing Section G for everything, and now they are pulling in GG. The nursing section has been compressed down to 25 rugs. The PT and OT adjustment factor under RCS-1 began, I believe, on day 14 or 15. I believe it was 14. And in this proposal, it begins on day 20. And they have also changed the group concurrent combination to 25% of therapy treatment time. A couple of new things that we're seeing is that there will be a Section O completion that they're proposing for the PPS discharge assessment, a new interim payment assessment, and an interruption stay policy. And again, we're going to go through all of these. I just wanted to give everyone a little bit of an outline of some of the differences from the RCS-1. So here we have our base rate for urban and rural, and we're going to utilize these numbers moving forward as we look at some of the formulas. Here are the case mix components for each of the areas that we talked about. So, for example, PT and OT have a primary reason for SNF care and a functional status that will impact payment for each of those categories. Speech has several areas that we will talk about. Nursing is going to be generally based on the RUGs, and then there are some comorbidities and services, extensive services, that impact the non-therapy ancillary. Let's walk through what some of these components look like. The PT and OT component, the way we determine those are exactly the same. So I'm going to combine those in these few slides. But if the first step in trying to determine this PT and the OT component are to select a clinical category. And you can see on the left-hand column, and I know it's a little bit blurry, on the left-hand column, they have put together 10 clinical categories in which they felt all patients would fall in. They have collapsed those even further into 4 total categories for the PT and OT component. So you've got major joint replacement or spinal surgery, non-orthopedic surgery and acute neuro. We've got other orthopedic, and then we've got medical management. So this is based on Section I-8000 of the MDS. And what this proposed rule, what CMS is saying right now, is that the I-8000 section of the MDS will now be the primary reason for SNF stay. So that diagnosis is going to be incredibly important as the MDS coordinator or whoever is assigned puts that diagnosis into the MDS, because it will then determine several other categories of payment. From that ICD-10, CMS has developed some crosswalks. So there are pathways that they have developed depending on what the diagnosis is that would fall into one of these 4. So we've gotten our clinical category, and now the next step is to determine a functional score. There are 10 items through section GG, not G, but GG, that we are going to be utilizing. And GG has been around for, almost a couple of years now, so we've gotten more used to that. But here are the specific sections that will be utilized for the PT and OT components. And for each of these items, you can see there are 3 self-cares. We've got bed mobility, transfer, and ambulation. And as we score these, for each score here, on the left, you will see a score here to the right. And the score on this right-hand column is the score that we utilize to get a total score for PDPM. So what I did want to point out as well is that the more independent the patient is, the higher the score. I know sometimes with Section G we see, the inverse relationship, but I do appreciate that the higher the score on our response to where the patient is under usual performance, the score also goes up for purposes of the PDPM payment. So this top chart here is everything. This is how we score everything except walking items. And then this bottom one includes the walking items. And the only difference between these two that they are proposing is that you score a 0 under the score category if the resident is unable to walk. So once we've done that, we total up the scores and get a total. For PT and OT, the scores can range from 0 to 24. So here's what the table looks like. We talked about determining the clinical category. We now have a score for the GG. Here is the case mix group, and then you get a case mix index from the PT or from OT here. And I'm going to show you all an example of what that looks like. So this is a busy slide, but I wanted to keep it all on one slide if possible, just so I could talk through it. So the top part of this slide goes through the formula that we discussed earlier. We've got our base rate, CMI, and an adjustment factor. We just talked about steps 1 and 2 in determining what that CMI looks like. So I'm going to pretend that we have Mr. Smith, and he was a patient that fell, no fractures or any other orthopedic problems that may be developed. I'm going to say pneumonia and maybe some sepsis, and so they're admitted to the SNF for medical conditions. So we're going to say they're in the clinical category of med management. And we're going to come up with a functional score of 15. If you take the chart that I showed on the previous slide, they're under medical management. The category is a TK, And here are your case mix index for PT and one for OT. So we've got a base rate based, I'm going to say this is based on rural. We've got a base rate for PT. We found out up here that our CMI was 1.52, and we multiply those together to get our PT rate. Again, we do the same thing for OT. The numbers just look a little bit differently, but otherwise we determine them the same way. So we've got a total of $95.64 per day for this patient specifically. The other area to talk about specifically for PT and OT is that CMS has added or proposed an adjustment factor. And that's what this looks like. I'm giving specifically a PT example here. What they are saying is that for days 1 through 20, you're going to get that $102.79 that we just talked about. After that, every 7 days, the payment for these specific categories is going to go down 2%. So I've shown you a chart that they shared in the proposed rule and what this would potentially look like. So for this same patient, in determining the daily rate, day 21 would have a 2% reduction. At day 28, it would then again have another 2% reduction, and that is what this looks like. And that would continue based on the chart every 7 days through day 100 if they were to stay that long. Okay, that's it for PT and OT. We're going to move on to speech. Speech also has 2 steps in determining what category they're going to fall in. And the step 1 actually has 3 parts to it, so I'm going to go through each of those parts. The first determinant is for diagnosis, and the question is whether it's an acute neurodiagnosis or a non-neurodiagnosis. And you can see, again, from the table that is shared from the proposed rule that the majority of patients are going to fall under that non-neurologic category, except unless it's an acute neurologic diagnosis. And again, they've got crosswalks as to what diagnoses fall under here. So we're determining, again, acute neuro or non-neuro. The second part of step 1 is to determine if this patient has 1 or more speech comorbidities. So here are the list of proposed comorbidities. For example, a patient may have a prior CDA. They may have a history of some apraxia. They may have a traumatic brain injury. If they do, we will check that off as to yes, they do have a speech comorbidity based on this chart. The third part of this is to determine cognitive impairment. This comes straight from the MDS, Section C, which is the BIM section. And if there is cognitive impairment based on the BIM score, which would be less than 13, we would also say yes, patient has cognitive impairment based on that score. And so that's what this looks like. So here are the 3 parts of step 1. If they have an acute neuro condition, you've got a 1. If there is a speech comorbidity, even if it's more than 1 on that chart, you go yes, check. And if they have a cognitive impairment. So out of those 3 questions, we answer whether they have none, 1 of these, any 2, or 3. And you're going to see what that looks like in the chart in just a minute. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to determine whether the resident has a swallowing disorder or a mechanically altered diet. We pick either, neither, or both. And that, too, is based on Section K in the MDS and how that is answered. So again, we've got 2 parts even to step 2. We've got whether they have a swallowing disorder and or a mechanically altered diet. We answer either, neither, or both. So here's what it looks like in a chart. And again, this is from the proposed rule. So again, on the left-hand side, we've got the presence of acute neurodiagnosis, one of the comorbidities we looked at, or cognitive impairment. We pick none, 1, 2, or 3 of those. Mechanically altered diet, swallowing disorder, it's neither, either, or both. And from that, we determine the case mix group and the case mix index. So again, here's the example. If we took that same patient we talked about, and let's say we've got a medical management diagnosis, I'm going to pretend that this patient has a history of a CDA, so that's one of the comorbidities that was listed. They have no cognition issues, and they have no swallow issues or special diet, I'm going to count, okay, so for step 1, they have one of those conditions. So going back to the chart on the previous slide, we have 1, we have no swallow issues or special diet, we have a case mix of SD, and the case mix index is 1.46. So again, we take our base rate and we multiply it times the 1.46. That is the daily rate for the speech component. The nice thing about speech is that there is no adjustment factor. So that rate would stay the same throughout the length of stay. Moving on to nursing. The nursing were combined from current rugs, which I believe is 43, to they combined them into 25 rugs. And they're based on, as you all know, it's going to look very similar to what you all know, clinical conditions of the stay. We were also going to be determining a functional score based on GG, extensive services, certainly, the way we would, just like we would capture them now. And depression and restorative will also be important factors in determining the nursing component. So here they are again, extensive services, special care high and low, clinically complex, behavioral symptoms and cognitive performance, and reduced physical function. And I'm going to show you all, I'm going to hand these out, but one of the nice handouts that I'm going to share with you guys is a handout that CMS put out that can walk through each step of this. And there are some nice handouts as well from a nursing perspective to determine what category they would fall in. And it tells what MDS section as well. So we go through the normal steps of determining RUG score or determining RUG category for nursing. And then we're also going to determine a functional score based on GG. The difference with this one, and I'm going to show you a comparison between what's captured here versus what's captured for PT and OT, there are fewer items for GG for nursing. But we do have an eating and a toileting. There is a bed mobility and a transfer section. And something that I didn't point out, and I apologize, on the previous one is that for the transfer and the bed mobility, you actually average those two out. So you would take the score on the sitting to lying and lying to sitting on edge of bed, for example, and then you would divide that total score by 2 to get your score for those. But just like with PT and OT, the scoring is based on the higher the level of independence, the higher your score is going to be. So instead of a total of 24, which we had for PT and OT, there is a total of 16 potential. So on this slide, I just showed you the difference between the scoring. There are 3 additional areas for PT and OT, GG versus nursing. 2 of those items specifically are the ambulation areas. And then in addition, there is an oral hygiene area that was added in determining the GG functional score. So again, here we go. We're just going to add those scores up and get a total. Just wanted to spend a minute. There are some definite key drivers from a nursing category, and this certainly isn't all of them, but I wanted to highlight just a few of the areas. Section I, we mentioned earlier, going to be really vital the way the system is proposed right now, because the diagnosis that is put in Section I is going to drive so many of these components. So having the accuracy of that diagnosis is going to be critical. Section GG, again, just to reiterate, we've talked about that. You know, what we don't know right now, and there was no mention of it, are we still going to define GG as usual performance? Right now, they haven't said anything to the contrary, so it would be interesting to see how CMS is going to play that out, or if they're going to define that any differently. We don't know the answer to that yet. There was no mention of that in the proposed rule. Section C, we mentioned BIM score, going to be really important as well as we score through those to determine speech component, for example. Section D impacts the depression score, which also impacts you get a little bit higher, typically CMI, on the nursing component if the patient has any type of signs and symptoms of depression. And then restorative, again, If restorative is checked off, you typically get a little bit higher of a CMI based on that. So this is just a snippet of many of the categories that nursing has, certainly, but here are the RUG categories as we know them now. And then this category right here, I know there's not a header on it, but it talks about whether the patient shows signs and symptoms of depression based on Section D of the MDS. This column here is your ADL score, and so here's your CMI. These are the score, and then here's your CMI based on the category. So on this top one, it's going to be a 1 point, you got your base rate, and you would multiply it times 1.99. One of the things that the proposed rule also talks about is that there is an HIV/AIDS add-on, and they recognize that there is an increase in cost due to HIV/AIDS patients, the facility will get an 18% increase in the nursing component. This is based on ICD-10 code B20, which has to be present on the SNF claim. And what they say is that this specific nursing component would be multiplied by 1.18 to account for that 18% increase. The next category is the non-therapy ancillary, and again, there's a larger list than this. I didn't want to, it's pretty lengthy, so I didn't cut and paste all of it. But what I did want to review is that the non-therapy ancillary is based on essentially this chart or table, and you get points based on the complexities or the services that are listed here. And if the patient has any of these, and again, it's based on MDS items on whether they're checked off or not, you get points. You can see this column here has point assignments to it. And the more points you get, the higher the CMI. And here's what that table looks like. So if you have a score of 12 or above based on that table that we just reviewed, your case mix index is a 3.25. So to determine the non-therapy ancillary daily rate, you've got your base rate, you've got your CMI based on what we just talked about. There is also an adjustment factor for this category. On days 1 through 3, CMS has said that they acknowledge that at the beginning of a patient's stay, that there are many more resources that are needed for these patients. That's typically when orders are coming in, we're getting the patient settled, we're ordering equipment, that type of thing. So they actually are giving us 3 times the amount for the first 3 days of the patient's stay. On days 4 through 100, it goes back down. So you've got your base rate, again, times your CMI, which we determine up here, and then the adjustment factor would be 3 times that for the first 3 days of stay. So again, this is what it looks like. We talked about each of the different components and how it is determined. And remember, the non-case mix payment doesn't change. So for a patient's stay, we add up all of that, and that is going to be their daily rate. Regardless of whether the patient receives therapy, that rate is going to stay the same. Okay? And that's different for us, I know. We're not used to, if the patient doesn't receive therapy, that could change the RUG score, for example. But here, we determine the rates regardless of what services the patient is providing. It's based on these categories and the determinants that we have talked about. I did put up an example here based on the Mr. Smith scenario that I talked about a few minutes ago. We talked about PT, OT, and speech. I put him into a clinically complex category for nursing. I put him in ND, which was a little bit lower for non-therapy ancillary, and what this potentially could look like. So we've got our CMI for each of the categories. Again, non-case mix doesn't have a CMI. The base rate that was shared, and I did a subtotal for each of these. On days 1 through 3, this patient, the facility would receive $365.66. And remember, we multiplied the subtotal by 3 to get that higher amount. That $300 or almost $300 really made a big difference for that daily rate. On days 4 through 20, we added up all these numbers to get the $565, And then remember, on day 21, the PT and OT components go down 2%. So I just wanted to show an example of what that would look like with that 2% drop. Want to talk a few minutes just about some of the upcoming MDS changes that you all can discuss in the facility, because certainly this looks and feels much different than what we have done in the past. Right now, the way CMS has proposed this, there will be a 5-day assessment, essentially, and a PPS discharge assessment. Other than that, there will be a new assessment called an interim payment, which is similar to a SIG change, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So the 5-day assessment is essentially what's going to determine the payment for our patients. That 5-day assessment coding is going to be vital. So making sure that we have the correct information, that we know the complexities and the comorbidities, and that the functional scoring is as accurate as we are aware of, is going to be vital in determining payment for our patients. In addition, then we would have a PPS discharge assessment. Right now, the PPS discharge assessment is only required for those patients who are discharged from Medicare but stay in the long-term care facility. CMS is now saying that that assessment would be completed on everyone. The IPA, or the interim payment assessment, I think there are still a lot of questions to be answered in regards to that. But what they are saying is that it would allow the facility an opportunity to submit a different MDS based on a change. And they are defining that change based on a change in the resident's classification in the first tier of any of those components that we just discussed. So if they're, for example, under the PT and OT component, the first tier is the clinical condition or the diagnosis. If there were a change in that, then the facility may be able to submit an IPA. This has to be done within 14 days after the change is identified. We also wanted to stress, though, that if the patient is expected, if it's just a temporary change and they're expected to return to baseline, then it wouldn't be an appropriate assessment. But again, I think there are still a lot of questions on what that really looks like, so I'm anxious to see whether the final rule updates or changes any of that definition. Another update to the MDS is that they finally are removing grace days, which I was very grateful for and feel like they probably should have done a long time ago. So the 5-day assessment, the ARD is going to be days 1 through 8. There are no grace days associated with that. And then one of the other areas that they talk about is what's called a non-fatal warning edit on the validation report. So you all know you submit the MDSs and you get reports back. This isn't a fatal warning, it's a non-fatal warning. But we talked about one of the changes is that they're going to allow 25% total of group and concurrent therapy. And they want to make sure that that does not go above and beyond the limits that they have set. So if they do see that that percentage has changed or gone above the 25%, the facility would get that non-fatal warning, just to indicate, hey, you're out of compliance on group and concurrent. We're going to talk a little bit more about how they're going to track that in just a minute. There is also a proposed interruption stay policy, which says that if a patient goes out and if they're discharged from the SNF to anywhere, that can be home, hospital, somewhere else, and then returns by 12 a.m. of the 3rd day, there's no interruption in payment. So you would pick right up where you left off without having to redo MDSs and assessments. If they stay longer than that, then you have to, after the 4th day, it's considered a readmission. Going to talk for just a few minutes about therapy medical necessity, because, and I'm not going to read certainly this whole slide, but I did want to talk about the fact that CMS is acknowledging that therapy is still an important part of outcomes for the patients. And what they essentially say in the proposed rule is that they want to assure that residents continue to receive therapy that is reasonable and necessary and tailored to meet their unique needs. And I know Mary's going to talk here in just a minute about the importance of what we do and the importance of function and those quality outcomes, not just for the patient, but to help that transition of care. They are going to continue, CMS is saying they're going to continue to monitor that to make sure that our patients receive the best quality care possible. And how are they going to do that? On that PPS discharge assessment, there will be a Section O. And here are the questions that they say they are going to track through Section O. And you can see on there for each discipline, they've got a PT, an OT, and a speech category. We want start date and end date and total number of minutes. They're also going to track group and concurrent, which goes back to the previous slide that I talked about, and then monitoring that 25%. So what they're essentially saying is, hey guys, you guys have been treating a lot of patients, they've been receiving a lot of therapy. We want to make sure that that just doesn't stop, that these patients are continuing to receive necessary care. And so they want to look at those minutes, and they're going to start tracking those. Again, they haven't gotten into too much specific on what this looks like, but they have said this Section O will be on the discharge assessment, and they're going to be tracking it. And I am going to now, so I've gone through the basics of how to determine payment through PDPM, and I am going to give the microphone to Mary Vandekamp, who's going to talk about a few other areas on the impact of therapy and you all in a facility. Okay.
Thanks, Liz. As you can all tell from the great overview that Liz gave, that this is still complicated. We all spent a lot of time in the discussion around RCS-1, and if you were part of our last seminar, we believe that it was way too complicated to be actually implemented. We do have, I guess, a little bit stronger sense that this will be closer to implementation because they've delivered the specs to the IT companies in terms of how we will start to prepare for that. You know, I think as we really sit down as an industry and talk about this, we want to talk about a cultural and a delivery change. Those of us that were part of pre-PPS, I used to say how many were there. Now I say, were you born? We've really grown to live in a very minute-driven utilization world, and I think for many of us it was not ever seen as an ideal world. Certainly, the research on 720 minutes opposed to 500. I think we all questioned, even though there's a lot of work done initially on that structure. We do know it's utilization-based, and I think what we've seen from every outlet, from MedPAC to CMS to ACOs, we're looking at how we become more patient-centered, and that's what I think we all feel better about. With that, however, does not come easy systems. You know, we have the ability in every other sector to look at an episode of care. In our inpatient rehab hospitals, in our LTACs, in our home health, they look at an entire episode, and really our skilled world was a little bit of an anomaly and certainly caused a lot of scrutiny, as we've all seen. Moving to a patient-centered payment that is looked at in a value proposition, I think we all feel good about. How we really live in that world is yet to be seen. I think the danger we all have is trying to move too quickly into a new payment system before we have the rules. I remember that a number of companies, they jumped into PPS before the final rules were put out and became financially, and I think quality, was certainly impactful. We do know that outcomes matter, and that is a great opportunity for value placement. Outcomes to a patient is what makes the difference between getting back to their prior level or remaining with a high level of care. It's comprehensive care plans that allow us to achieve those goals, and that doesn't change, as Liz said. Skilled component remains highly important and will be highly scrutinized. We'll talk a little bit more about another culture shift around skilled documentation. Accuracy of functional outcome measurement is key. One of the most recent audits that we've seen in our company is where they are looking at the acute function and then comparing it to how we assess the function in the post-acute setting, be it our skills, our home health, or our inpatient or LTAC. Accurate coding of function, because now it turns from a utilization payer to a function value, the scrutiny on how we code becomes even more important. ICD-10 coding, incredibly important. Something for us to consider, as we'll talk at the end, is what do we need to do to prepare about the very complex coding required. Most of the industries that have a coding-driven payment have coders that are specialized in understanding the chart and those drivers that impact the payment as well as the way we'll be measured for quality. We understand that the clinical flexibility for group and concurrent is a value add if and when we measure the delivery of that care based on the outcome we provide. Certainly, efficient delivery is something the government asks us to do as part of their triple aim. But without a way to determine that the way in which we treat the patient clinically appropriately can be measured through an outcome is the key component. One without the other leads to risk, as I think we all know. Measuring the 25% component, something we want to talk about. While it is not a game stopper, I think certainly we all know that any data that's provided to CMS can drive scrutiny and review by MACs and RACs and other intermediary review. How we delivered therapy before PPS, before our new payment within the PPS system is going to be compared to how we deliver it afterwards. And if we are doing the right thing today, and I believe we are, most patients are coming to our facilities to get great nursing care and to get great rehabilitation so they can return back to their communities, they're going to look at that. And their belief, is going to either be justified that we gave too much, if we change dramatically, which I don't believe we are giving too much care today. As we see the kinds of patients that are coming into our buildings, very complex, patients that need a lot of our attention, nursing, therapy, physician, and social services. So how we look at our new world is something we begin to think about today. Granted, we've always been hesitant in our teams to give you the story of tomorrow because the story of tomorrow is not written yet. However, we can tell you what we believe and is predictable about a patient-centered episodic payment because we live in that world every day in some of our other sites of service. I love that function matters. I think we all know that if you're able to function in your environment, the risk associated with returning to the hospital is much, much less. Studies have shown us that while earlier predictors of rehospitalization were the number of comorbidities, now one of the main predictors is the functional ability of the patient to remain safely in their homes, in skilled nursing, or in other sites of service. Something that is, I think, been the bane of all of us is the scrutiny of the value of the services, not through patient outcomes, which has been a bit lacking, but through the integrity of our documentation. And I think we've all lived with a heightened scrutiny of therapy documentation because ultimately therapy was the driver of the payment. What is a cultural shift for all of us is now nursing documentation becomes the focus of support of the clinical identification of the category for which you'll be paid. Also important will be the documentation of your PT, OT, and speech. Clearly, with the additional dollars spent on those services, but with the majority of the expectation to be done on the ICD coding and the complexity of the patient relative to nursing, I think we have a opportunity for all of us to work together to improve the quality of how we move that, that dial. So how do we prepare today? This is still unknown, but we are pretty confident. I guess we're not comfortable. We're confident that this will be a year from October. We cannot wait another day to start some of the things we should be thinking about as an industry and as a rehab care as a partner to you. We need to look at the hospital documentation. We need to be sure that we're getting a comprehensive file as it comes into our buildings. We can begin to set expectations with our hospitals on what we need to have in order to give a full picture. And then the coding of that information, both previous to admission and upon admission, is ultimately the driver of the episodic care payment. I think we need to be very realistic about who is doing that, and is that something that our current teams can do without additional expertise and training. As you saw from Liz's presentation, missing one key element of the medical record has a significant impact on the payment for the care. And the very important part of that accurate payment is that this patient is going to require the resources that will have to be paid for by that payment. If we're not ensuring that we have the right information early enough with the right competency and expertise to determine the elements of payment, then we will give great care, but the reimbursement will not be able to support that. Care management, discharge planning, day one is key. Clearly, there's an impetus to shorten the length of stay from the way the payment system is put in place. The PT and OT add-ons are done at day 20. Interesting, they pick day 20. That being said, it is your and our responsibility as your partner to provide the absolute best care in the time that we have with them to improve the ability to discharge safely, because not only do they have to be discharged safely, you will be penalized if they return to the hospital. So that whole piece is tying together now. There's a discharge penalty, there's a hospital penalty if they don't discharge appropriately, and now there will be a skilled nursing penalty if we don't discharge appropriately. So what we do and how we manage that care and how we code for the payment is going to have to be done in a much shorter time frame, and we have to be able to deliver on that. And I can tell you that we have spent a lot of time taking a look at that, because what we do today is what we need to be able to perfect, to be able to live in this new world. Nursing documentation, a key, I cannot stress this enough. Those of us that have lived through the heightened scrutiny of medical necessity in therapy documentation, that doesn't go away. But we have spent a lot of time, and with your help, that same tight scrutiny of medical necessity of nursing documentation, because if the skilled stay is not very transparent through the documentation, there is always the review that they will keep in place, but it'll shift from a utilization review of therapy to a medical complexity review of nursing documentation. We have to train our therapists to know and understand how our documentation supports the medical necessity of the patient and supports the nursing documentation. Function as a standalone is no longer going to support the entire payment. So there is a huge opportunity for us to begin today, and we are beginning today, to be prepared for what we need to have in place to support the payment and to provide the best possible care for those patients. How do we do it? We really have to look at how we do our meetings. We have to be efficient. We have to have the ability to come to these meetings, no different than today, but really very more complex than today, because it's an interdisciplinary, patient-centered approach, which in everything that we know and believe in, that's the right answer. We need to get out of the discipline focus into the patient and working together to make that happen. Who's the best in the facility to help you do that? So as we sort of talk through these next steps of how we prepare, I want to plant some seeds of ways that we need to partner together. I've heard, and certainly I've heard probably as much as you've heard, is that let's take this program in-house. There's a whole need to do that. Certainly, I think, we as a company are absolutely looking at multiple levels of partnership. But let's talk for a minute about something that I want you to look at in your gyms and in your teams. You have a very, very educated workforce that could be repurposed and re-engineered to support some of the other functions that you have in your facility. How do we take a committed team of professionals and work closely with care transitions, care management, coding, wound care, cognitive and memory units? We need to get out of the mindset that you only need a therapist to drive your minutes of care. And I know that's not what you think, because we think about patient care, but ultimately the payment has driven us to think a little bit more one-for-one. We have to broaden our strategy to think about how do we start to look at a professional workforce where nursing is very difficult to find. And I can tell you the thought that there will be a lot of therapists, I think, again, you know, memory, we don't want to repeat history. And when PPS came in, everyone thought therapists would just absolutely be a dime a dozen. And we know for a fact they left the industry. And over a period of time, we've gotten right back to the need for more therapy. Our recruiting team works incredibly hard to find therapists. I just saw new information that came out that the workforce in healthcare is driven to the community-based care. The significant number of hires in our home health and in our outpatient has risen 25% greater than healthcare hiring in other sectors. And so therapists will move out unless we find ways to bring them and find that partnership that I believe we can do within our skilled nursing. The demographics of the elderly are something we all are very aware of, some of us even more aware than others about how that FAFSA is coming on. With that, we don't have a glutton of therapists. So where will those therapists go? They will go to other sectors. So I think we need to be very, very careful that we don't assume that we will be certainly we will not need as many therapists, absolutely. But we need to think about how we repurpose and how we bring them together and how we make that work environment something they want to participate in. We shifted our program focus in rehab care to the Right Path programs a year and a half ago because we honestly believed how important it was for the patient to be at the center of the program. We hired 5 nurses to come on to our therapy staff because we realized we were not a single driver of care. We needed the expertise of that team. Liz is an RN and a certified rehabilitation nurse. We have a number of other nurses. We work closely together in rehab to be a solution, not to be just a therapy provider, because we realized an IDT team that you live every day is one that we had to understand in order to build the best programs. We do not want our patients returning to the hospital. We want them to live safely in the community in which they want to live. We have experience in episodic payment. That's been incredible. We have a great financial team. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work they're doing today, but we understand episodic payment. We live that world. We understand the risk share. So we are talking, what are the ways we partner on how to do that without compromising the importance of providing the best functional outcomes through the incredibly strong therapy and nursing programs. We have coding expertise. We have hospital coders that we've learned from. Therapists spend a lot of time in ICD-10 coding. It is never more important that we build our coding strength today. If we are good coders today, it'll only bode well for us for whatever payment system comes forward. And then we've had outcomes in our company since 1999. And for years, people are like, why are you collecting outcomes? And finally, because it matters, everyone's like, where are the outcomes? We've been doing this. We understand that collecting outcomes is not just about collecting outcomes. It's about the integrity. It's about the workflow process. It's about the importance of understanding exactly what you're measuring. And now more than ever, it's going to be used to determine value. Functional outcomes have an important role, and I think we're all excited about that because we know, any one of us, how we function becomes paramount to our happiness and to our satisfaction with our lifestyle. So we now have an opportunity to build on what we've done, but bring it more to the forefront in concert with nursing and social services around looking at the ways in which we're coding together. The analysis that our finance team has begun to do, and again, we don't have the rules, so we're certainly out there, as you are, trying to do some prediction. But they have reviewed the CMS information, which we'll send out to you as well. There is a CMS-provided provider-specific file that details the estimated impact of the PDPM model. That's generated for your facility off your Medicare number. So our finance team took the aggregate of our 800 or so clients out of a pool of, John gave you the exact number, but approximately 13,500, 14,000 overall facilities to get us some sense of what will payment look like at a very high level. Again, not building specific. And what it really showed us is, and this is the caveat that every one of us needs to be aware of, assuming no changes in the provider behavior or the resident case mix. Big assumption. We already know length of stay may be impacted. We also know that if the way we deliver care, we need to be very sensitive to it. So their assumption is that assuming nothing changes, what will the impact be? In the overall impact to these approximately 14,000, there was a slight decline in payment. In our 800, there was a revenue increase of 1.5%. That tells me one thing, and I want to thank you all for being our partners, because that means we're doing the right thing today. If we are capturing the case mix, if we are delivering the appropriate amounts of care, and we're not overutilizing or underutilizing, we have an opportunity to do well. But it's because we have always partnered on doing the right thing. And understanding the rules is so important, but understanding the patient-centered care is absolutely, if you do the right thing, the payment follows. What we have in front of us today is a new opportunity to do the right thing, to prepare our teams to think differently, to work together more closely, and to ultimately provide the absolute best quality and be reimbursed for that care. It takes all of us together. The complexities of managing a triage of clinicians, the ability to recruit to the right area, the ability to sit down and talk about the appropriate coding, based on the fact that, you know, MDS coding is the exact opposite of GG. So how do we work together to get the accuracy? There's so much opportunity for us in this world to be the very best providers of care, but it's going to take all of us working together, and it's going to take all of us keeping the patient first. It's no longer a therapy company. It's really a solution-driven partner who understands what you need, what your patients need, and we have the flexibility and expertise to have that, to support you in that goal. So while everything is a little bit unknown and change makes everyone a little nervous, I can tell you that here we are very excited about the opportunity to think differently, to look at a new world, and to do it even better. If we improve patient care, if we improve patient experience, and we find ways that we can get payment for that care, then it's a better world for that. So we cannot thank you enough for being our partner. We will be sending this out to you I guess, how long does it take, Liz?
Just a day or two.
Just a couple of days. You'll have our presentation. We are also blessed by an incredible operations team. We have terrific leaders at every level of the organization, from Glenda Mack, our COO, to our regional vice presidents, to our ADOs, to our clinical teams, to a tremendous finance team, a strong recruiting team. We know we are here because of you, and we are all a phone call away. So can't thank you enough. Obviously, when we get the rules, we'll come back to you with more information, but there are things we should start to do today, and I encourage you to think that we start now. Thanks, everyone.